People could speculate about ending the wars, but I think the best evidence now we have available for us is who he actually appointed. Who is going to be running U.S. foreign policy in the form of the State Department? One of the most zealous, interventionist, or quote-unquote pro-war people in the entire U.S. Senate.
Some people say that there will be a balance in the cabinet between the, let's say, MAGA people and the neocons. Does that make sense for you?
No, not at all. MAGA and neocon have merged. For example, if people are surprised by him now appointing virulent pro-Israel operators to key positions, then they must have just either been ignoring what Trump did, or they were following the wrong information sources, or they were deluding themselves.
They said they would dismantle the deep state. Are they going to do it with Tulsi Gabbard, or what do you think?
I don't see any indication that there's any substantive intent to dismantle the deep state. I see an intention to do some bureaucratic reorganization of the deep state to better advance Trump's interests and therefore better advance American hegemony as Trump prefers it.
Hello, friends. Today we have one of the truly impartial and non-partisan U.S. journalists. Michael Tracey is our guest today. He has contributed to a wide range of publications like The Nation, The American Conservative, the New York Daily News, etc. Now he is an independent journalist. Thank you for your time, Michael.
Happy to be with you.
So everybody is talking about Trump's cabinet. Here it is. It's not the whole cabinet, of course, but we know some names. First of all, while the cabinet is taking shape, are the names a surprise for you?
No, not at all. They're a surprise to some who had a flawed perception or interpretation of Trump's third campaign for the presidency. But, for example, the selection of Marco Rubio, I think, is entirely expected. That is the one that I would have been following most closely, because the position of Secretary of State is an extremely powerful and influential position dating back to the very founding of the United States. It's not just one of these newly created bureaucratic inventions of the past couple decades. It's one of the pillars of the U.S. government since its founding. And Donald Trump has made very clear that anybody who proclaims, quote unquote, America first as a branding exercise, as a public sloganeering tactic, can reliably ingratiate themselves with the Trump operation. Donald Trump and Marco Rubio ran against one another in the 2016 Republican primaries. And the idea at that time was that Trump and Rubio represented sharply different foreign policy dispositions. Marco Rubio was a representation of what is sometimes pejoratively referred to as a neoconservative foreign policy disposition, which is very interventionist, very bellicose, very moralistic in the conduct of foreign policy to impose and expand American hegemony. Whereas Trump was presenting himself at the time as something at least somewhat different, more of a transactional approach to foreign policy, less ideologically blinkered, less ideologically zealous. And as it happens, as the years go by, Marco Rubio and Donald Trump basically merge their respective brands. And Rubio becomes a point person for, in particular, Trump's foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. So Rubio is a rabid proponent of regime change initiatives in places like Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela. And he successfully enlisted Trump to sign on to all those initiatives during Trump's first term. Now, so Trump and Rubio discarded whatever ostensible political disagreements they may have had in 2016 and became governing partners over the course of Trump's first term. And Trump was always very clear that Rubio was part of his prospective governing coalition. He was a finalist for the vice presidential pick. In fact, arguably, the position of Secretary of State is more influential and more powerful than the vice presidential selection. The Secretary of State has far more long-established enumerated powers than the vice presidency, and the vice president is kind of ad hoc. I mean, it has very limited powers that are officially circumscribed or enumerated by the Constitution. So the Secretary of State is probably an even more significant position. So, although Trump, in all three of his presidential campaigns, has put out this notion that he is going to implement a vaguely less interventionist foreign policy. He and his surrogates had been proclaiming over the course of this campaign that he was going to usher in a new era of peace to the world and stop, spending all these needless monies abroad that could be better deployed domestically for American citizens. He couples that rhetoric with the introduction of a governing apparatus, which is extremely interventionist, arguably even more so than his first term. Because if you look at who Trump appointed the first time as Secretary of State, it was Rex Tillerson. Rex Tillerson was an unknown commodity. He was the CEO of ExxonMobil. Didn't appear to have any particularly strong ideological beliefs in 2016, 2017. And eventually, Trump, grew discontented with Tillerson, fired him via tweet, and installed Mike Pompeo. And Trump did something interesting, which last weekend he put out a Truth Social post, his social media website, saying he's not going to bring either Mike Pompeo or Nikki Haley back into a second Trump administration. And a lot of people took this to mean that he was repudiating the so-called neocons. Meaning he was going to have a vastly different approach to a second term as it relates to the conduct of foreign policy. And then what did he do? He appointed people who are substantively and ideologically interchangeable with those so-called neoconservative picks in the form of Pompeo and Haley. So you have, replacing Haley as UN ambassador, Elise Stefanik, who was one of the most virulent interventionists and hawks in the U.S. Congress, one of the most flamboyant advocates of the Israeli pulverization campaign in the Middle East, trying to whip up a so-called anti-Semitism hysteria in the United States. And then in terms of Pompeo, who Trump never had a falling out with, curiously enough, in his first term, unlike his relations with most of his senior cabinet officials. Well, Trump just replaced him with somebody who has no discernible differences substantively, that in the form of Marco Rubio, who for years has been one of the most vocal and well-known interventionists / neoconservatives in the Senate. So then, no, the picks haven't surprised me at all.
Okay. I'm following closely your tweets and articles, so I know that you are not surprised. Okay, but so you directly came to Rubio. Okay, then in this regard, I mean, what do you make of the claims that the new Trump administration will, on the one side, end the wars in the Ukraine and Gaza, etc. On the other side, I mean, we know we published today and yesterday some articles, reports about Rubio's concepts and opinions about China. So do you expect an escalation over there? And as I said, what about ending the wars? What Trump said.
You have to bear in mind that presidential candidates throughout history, the astute ones, the politically adroit ones, have often emphasized their vague desire or their alleged commitment to, quote, ending wars. Who on principle enjoys war? not most people, except the most rabid zealots. For a mass electorate, it's often an appealing message to claim that you favor the cessation of war. Richard Nixon in 1968 vaguely claimed that he was going to end the Vietnam War with honor. It was peace with honor. That was the slogan. But notably, it was rather untethered to any substantive policy program as to how he would allegedly end the Vietnam War. And what did he do when he got into office? He expanded and escalated the Vietnam War for his first term. They eventually had to end it with something less than honor by 1975, when they had to basically retreat from the U.S. diplomatic outpost there by helicopter. But the point is, you have to be a little bit more discerning as to the nature of political rhetoric in the United States. If it's not coupled with a tangible policy prospectus, then that should at least engender some degree of skepticism or some instinct to interrogate what the candidate actually means when he pledges to end the wars or to bring peace. And sadly, that was not done virtually at all over the course of this campaign as it related to Trump. He has such a rabid partisan cheering section, particularly on social media, on online media, on alternative media. He still has antagonists in the so-called mainstream media, but a lot of people, whoever are of a younger age, don't follow the mainstream media. So you have to, they get their media from alternative sources like podcasts or what have you. So you would hope that within those venues, there might have been some rational coverage of Trump in this area, but there really wasn't. And so, people could speculate about ending the wars, but I think the best evidence now we have available for us is who he actually appointed. Who is going to be running U.S. foreign policy in the form of the State Department in Trump's first term? It's one of the most zealous, interventionist, or quote-unquote pro-war people in the entire U.S. Senate. His national security advisor, Mike Waltz, is again one of the most zealous and committed interventionists / hawks in the U.S. House, including as it relates to Ukraine. So one of the farces, one of the canards that's constantly repeated by both Trump's supporters and his opponents is that he has this devious plan to betray Ukraine, or he has this sinister or secret collusive relationship with Putin. I mean, these narratives have been repeated for years now, and it's almost impossible to disabuse any one of them. But look at what his national security advisor said the day before the election, not 6 months ago, not a year and a half ago, the day before the election, November 4th, 2024. Mike Waltz, who Trump subsequently named national security advisor, which, by the way, Trump has the most latitude in that appointment because the national security advisor serves solely at the pleasure of the president. It's not a position that has to be even confirmed by the Senate. So it's a position that is the most pure and direct reflection of whatever Trump's priorities are. And he named Mike Waltz, who the day before the election said that the manner in which Trump is allegedly going to end the war in Ukraine is to, number one, increase and intensify sanctions on Russia, and number two, loosen restrictions on Ukraine's ability to use U.S. munitions to strike deeper inside of Russia. So, accordingly, Mike Waltz's claimed plan for ending the Ukraine war is to escalate the Ukraine war. Now, I can't tell you with certainty that that's what Trump is going to do. All I have available to me is the evidence before us. And in terms of the appointments, the evidence is clear.
Does that show what you are telling now? Does that fact show the unpredictability of Trump? Because he said he will end the wars, and now he's appointing warmongers. Or is Trump using this unpredictability to I don't know, legitimize his actions, or because it's quite for a lot of people, maybe not for you, but for a lot of people, surprising. So this act of unpredictability, how do you evaluate this?
I don't think Trump is particularly unpredictable at this point. Maybe you could have made that argument in 2016, because Trump, coming into office at that point, had no governing experience. He had never served in the military. He was incredibly aberrational, historically aberrational in terms of the background of a U.S. president. So there was no real record to evaluate for Trump. But now we have 4 years of a record, and then we have almost 4 years of a post-presidential record in which he was basically the leader of the Republican Party, and he took various positions and endorsed various candidates and exerted his power over that coalition in an incredibly dominant way. Again, probably without precedent in U.S. history. And, for example, if people are surprised by him now appointing virulent pro-Israel operators to key positions, then they must have just either been ignoring what Trump did, or they were following the wrong information sources, or they were deluding themselves. Because Trump, there's nothing unpredictable about Trump's stance on Israel. He goes around bragging that he was the most pro-Israel president ever. Benjamin Netanyahu has enthusiastically agreed with that assessment, and they point to his actions taken as president. Trump himself has said that one of his chief donors, Sheldon Adelson, who's now deceased, and his spouse, Miriam Adelson, has taken up the mantle, pouring at least $100 million into Trump's 2024 campaign, just like they funded his 2020 campaign, and just like they funded his 2016 campaign. I mean, nothing unpredictable about that. We have lots of precedent. Trump has said that he took policy actions, like, for example, recognizing Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights. He took those policy actions at the behest of his top, quote-unquote, pro-Israel donors, the Adelsons. You have to pronounce it actually Adelson, and the hint for how to pronounce it is they add up their money. So what's unpredictable about that? I mean, what was unpredictable was the gullibility and credulity of people who wanted to believe something totally fictitious about Trump that was divorced from his record and divorced from his clearly observable policy positions. Like, for example, in the final days of the campaign, Trump shrewdly, because again, Trump is nothing if not politically shrewd, Trump went to Michigan and was endorsed by local Muslim imams on the ground that Trump was going to bring, quote, peace to the Middle East. Mm-hmm. Now, again, that's a slogan. Everybody likes to hear that peace in any region is allegedly forthcoming, but you have to drill down a little bit into the details if you're like a critical observer of American politics, right? And that really wasn't done, because by peace to the Middle East, what did Trump mean? What was he referring to? Well, as best anyone can tell, what he was referring to were the so-called Abraham Accords, which he claims were a series of peace deals in the Middle East. What were they in reality? They were arms deals to Gulf autocracies like the UAE, in which Trump and his nepotistic appointee Jared Kushner, who still wields influence over the administration, even if he's not going to be serving, we're told, in a formal role, where they brokered arms deal arrangements with Gulf potentates in exchange for them supposedly normalizing their ties with Israel. So that's not what peace did that create? Was the United Arab Emirates at war with Israel? No. The crux of why there is not, quote, peace in the Middle East, as Trump himself used to acknowledge but has now abandoned, was the Palestinian issue. And Trump's so-called peace deals totally sidelined the Palestinian issue, eventually, you could argue, leading to the events of October 7th and onwards, because the Palestinians had no diplomatic avenue to redress their grievances. And so that's the message that was presented to the imams in Michigan. Trump astonishingly won the city of Dearborn, Michigan, which has a high Muslim and Arab population. And if those people are now surprised that he's appointed zealots, pro-Israel zealots, anti-Palestinian zealots into key positions, then that's a flaw in the information environment that they were in, or it's a flaw in their critical capacity to analyze presidential candidates. I try to, for my part, provide them with the more clear-eyed picture of things, but I have limited influence.
It is, to be honest, it is interesting that you remind the imams, because to be honest, there has been some enthusiasm here in the region, in the Middle East, in different countries, that maybe the Trump administration will really bring peace to the Middle East or even to the Ukraine. I will come to some additional points, but before that, some people say that there will be a balance in the cabinet between the, let's say, MAGA people and the neocons. Does that make sense for you?
No, not at all. MAGA and neocon have merged as dispositions, right? You have the people who would have been the most...
This could be the headline or the heading. MAGA and neocons has emerged. Yeah.
But they've been merged for years.
Okay.
People who would have been previously regarded as the quintessential, quote-unquote, neocons have all adopted the mantra of America first. Because, again, if you just shout slogans and you don't actually examine the substantive underpinning of those slogans, then I think you're kind of foolish in terms of how you're examining American politics. There's a reason why Trump, in his campaign coterie this cycle, has had people like Marco Rubio, Tom Cotton, Lindsey Graham, Elise Stefanik, Mike Waltz, and on and on and on. These are the most virulent, quote-unquote, neoconservative, neocon-oriented people in the entire Congress. I actually have urged people to do away with the neocon label because it's lost utility. It obscures more than it reveals at this point. So I'm writing an article on that now. I'll be sure to publish it for everybody to read for themselves. But the point is, it really has lost any utility in terms of categorizing different foreign policy dispositions. So if you're arguing that there's a balance, well, who's going to be the counterbalance to Marco Rubio? I don't really follow that. Marco Rubio is going to be the one running the State Department. The National Security Advisor is going to be somebody who's basically ideologically indistinguishable with him. And so, is there a balance there? I'm not really seeing it. People point to Tulsi Gabbard, who was appointed as the Director of National Intelligence. But you got to remember, the Director of National Intelligence is kind of a peculiar position. It was only established in 2004 when the George W. Bush administration reorganized the management, effectively, of the so-called intelligence community and appointed somebody to run as like an overall manager or umbrella overseer of the various intelligence agencies. In terms of someone actually running the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, that's John, who was the previous Director of National Intelligence of the first Trump administration, and just a conventional interventionist hawk, essentially. In the run-up to this election, John Ratcliffe was going around saying that Iran had already committed, quote, acts of war against the United States by allegedly hacking Trump's campaign emails and allegedly plotting to assassinate Trump. And Ratcliffe has called for reprisal against Iran for those alleged acts of war. And that's the one running the CIA. So Tulsi Gabbard in particular, I covered Tulsi Gabbard literally closer than anyone else in the United States when she was running for president. I don't say that to be vain. That's just factually true. And she's basically abandoned a huge swath of the positions that she espoused in 2020 in her pursuit of power within the Republican coalition. For example, in 2020, she was denouncing Trump, and she actually introduced a censure resolution against Trump. Censure, C-E-N-S-U-R-E, resolution against Trump, which is a formal reprimand for, among other things, facilitating what Tulsi Gabbard called a genocide in Yemen. So Trump struck massive arms deals with the Saudi royal family in order for them to pulverize Yemen when Trump was first in office. So Trump escalated every war that he inherited, whether it was Afghanistan, Yemen. He expanded NATO twice. He expanded NATO architecture into Ukraine. He abandoned arms control paradigms with Russia, like the INF Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, all of which Tulsi Gabbard had condemned at the time, but she has abandoned those critiques. And she has adopted a entirely new formula, I guess, for advancing her own power, which is be rather sycophantic to Trump, hope that everybody forgets what you said just a few years ago. And then, if you get installed into some position, people are supposed to view that as providing a counterbalance against Trump. Maybe I would view that as a counterbalance against the more quote unquote neoconservative elements of the coalition, of the administration, if Tulsi Gabbard was actually adhering to what she had campaigned on a couple of years ago. But she's repudiated all that. So no, I don't view it as a counterbalance.
Now I will come to Tulsi. Here is another thing. I'm really curious what you will say about it, because I also followed the campaign and listened to a lot of speeches, etc. So the MAGA people and Trump, they said they would dismantle the deep state. Are they going to do it with Tulsi Gabbard, or what do you think?
I don't see any indication that there's any substantive intent to dismantle the deep state. I see an intention to do some bureaucratic reorganization of the deep state to better advance Trump's interests and therefore better advance American hegemony as Trump prefers it. But that's much different from dismantling the deep state as such. Now, it is true, and I covered this very closely at the time, that when Trump came into office in 2016, 2017, there were elements of the national security state apparatus that were clearly hell-bent on undermining him. It was unprecedented in American history. They viewed him as some nefarious interloper who jeopardized U.S. national security and therefore took shocking steps to try to impede him, to leak against him, to paint him as an illicit colluder with Russia on no justifiable grounds. So Trump clearly is now wielding his power, which he's been able to consolidate over the past 8 years, to ensure that stuff like that does not happen again. Now, does that mean that Trump is looking to dismantle the powers of the so-called deep state, like abolishing the CIA or undercutting the CIA's powers? I see no evidence of that at all. I see lots of evidence that the Republican governing coalition wants to reorganize bureaucratically elements of the national security state apparatus to better advance Trump's interests and to not undermine Trump. If you go and look at the so-called Project 2025 document, which the liberals made a big stink about over the course of this campaign, but the parts of it that they never bothered to read actually give some insight into how Republican executive branch officials might approach this issue in a forthcoming administration. And they're very clear in that document. Now, that document is not gospel necessarily, but it's an insight into how the Washington, D.C. conservatives are kind of organizing their potential governing options. And they're very clear. Their whole mission is to enhance the powers of the national security state to better serve Trump's interests and U.S. hegemonic interests, whether that's with regard to the Middle East, with China, with Russia, with Latin America and South America, or with a myriad of other issues. So, no, I see very little indication that this so-called dismantling of the deep state is in any way on the docket.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael Tracey. I think there are not so much voices or journalists who are analyzing the happenings similar to you and with this in-depth analysis. So it was very informative and enlightening, especially for the people who are following the happenings over there from abroad. So thank you again for your time.
All right, thank you.